Naval aviation is the most demanding flight environment in the world. The ship rocks and pitches, catapult off, tailhook back on. Most pilots wouldn't even consider doing this, much less do it day in and day out. And for good reason. It has its dangers. On land, you can't slam into the lip of the deck or catapult into the ocean. You won't snap a nose gear on the 3-wire or slip off the edge as you taxi. But all this can happen at sea, straight deck or angle, year in, year out, for as long as there has been carrier aviation. No one wants accidents, which is why the Navy videotapes carrier takeoffs and landings. In that way, every accident can become a valuable lesson for future pilots. And if they learn from what they see, then maybe they'll survive when it happens to them. The footage in this program spans the entire history of carrier operations. Pre-war, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, the Persian Gulf to today. The airplanes change, the style of dress changes, but still there are ramp strikes, and still there are cold caps. Yet through it all, there is a constant. We are safer today because of the men and women who endure these risks, so that we may live in the comfort of peace. For these aviators, there are indeed no easy days. To these aviators, we owe our peace.
Power, 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 power. Taxi, taxi, taxi. Get him out of there! Get him out of the fire!
On-clock pass, slightly right of course, 3/4 mile, call ball. 400 ball, 5 Roger, ball. Power, wave off. Jesus Christ!
Aviators study crash footage the way football players study game films. This is possible because of the ever-present eye of the shipboard camera. Collected over a 5-year period, the segments you are about to see have been pulled directly from the aircraft carriers and are presented the way they are seen on ship, raw and without narration. When sufficient information was available, we have added graphics to clarify the situation. Nothing else has been changed. spinning props, jet exhaust, air intakes. The flight deck is a place of almost constant motion. And within that swirl of activity are hundreds of close calls and dozens of near misses. It is almost taken for granted that every cruise will come back with at least one story of a plane that taxied off the side or of a green shirt blown off the deck. This is what it looks like to the deck cameras. A good takeoff begins with a catapult stroke forceful enough to accelerate an airplane up to flying speed. As the aircraft clears the deck, the wings should bite and the aircraft should climb steadily. In most cases, there shouldn't be much settling off the bow. When there is, the pilot has 60 feet to play with before the plane will hit the ocean. On rare instances, the catapult stroke is instant disaster. For example, when the catapult shot is weak, a cold cap, then the stroke does nothing more than push the plane forward and dump it off the deck. Thankfully, it doesn't happen often, but it does happen. There are also the occasional aircraft failures during the cat stroke. A gear snapping, for example, is remarkably common, or cargo tearing loose during the jerk forward. All too often, bad cats cost. The pilot has to eject, and the Navy has lost a plane. A good landing begins well before the ship is in sight, and then continues down through the stack and into the pattern until the aircraft is in the groove and flying the meatball. Up to that point, getting set up for the landing is just good piloting. Good landings, though, are teamwork. The pilot and the LSO, the landing signal officer. The LSO sees the aircraft, and sees the groove, and talks the pilot down the glide slope to the wires. If the approach looks bad, the LSO commands a wave-off, which can be easy and can be trouble. In a propeller plane, counter-rotation to the prop can spin a plane over onto its back. In any plane, the hook might accidentally snag a wire or the barrier and yank it back onto the deck. Then again, it may be just another go-around. The most feared mistake a pilot can make is a ramp strike. Bad judgment, a sudden loss of power, an unexpected loss of lift in the burble. Any of these can cause an aircraft to settle so far below the glide slope that the best a pilot can hope for is to hit the deck edge far enough behind the cockpit to get over the lip and maybe get out. Naturally, there are degrees of ramp strikes. Some are like a hot knife through butter. Many others merely scrape off the undercarriage or snap off the main gear. These are spectacular and full of flames, but the pilot often gains control, clears the deck, and safely ejects. Interestingly, even horrifying strikes can be survived. Sadly, though, most are not. On the old straight deck carriers, a pilot could accidentally float over the arresting cables and slam into the aircraft parked on the bow. Wire barriers were designed to prevent that, or at least try to prevent that. They were anything but elegant. But then again, they had a simple job: to snag a plane in the air and pull it down before it could do more serious damage. Although to the pilot it must have felt horrible, it was far better to be tripped up than to crash. Naturally, hitting the barrier made for interesting footage indeed. Sometimes on purpose, sometimes by accident, there are hard landings. Most of the time, nothing more than the pilot's ego is bruised. On other occasions, rockets or drop tanks snap off, a nose wheel is crushed, or the entire undercarriage collapses. Nonetheless, hard landings are usually the sort of landings a pilot can walk away from, which in aviation is still a good landing.
This is Rocket Tower. We'll have about a 7-minute delay.
Navy aviators are practical, and they never ignore their risks. It is far better to anticipate problems and be over-prepared than to lose an airman to a survivable accident. During air operations, a designated ship called plane guard pulls up close enough to the carrier to quickly dash forward and be useful in a rescue. Of course, plane guard is no substitute for the helicopters that hover near the ship. Many a pilot owe their lives to the wet helo flight back from the drain. Shipboard fires are feared by all captains at sea, and yet for all the training and protective measures in place on a carrier, fires happen. In the Navy, there is one fire known up and down the ranks, a killer of seaman and officer alike. It was the Forrestal fire. A simple slip-up, a Zuni rocket misfiring across the deck, triggered an inferno that killed over 100.
There, on deck. Somehow a Zuni rocket has been triggered, roaring across the flight deck and hitting an A4 Skyhawk. A sheet of flame from the A4's ruptured fuel tank has enveloped the Skyhawk and her immediate neighbors. Behind that curtain of smoke, 2 1,000-pound bombs have already dropped from her wings onto the burning deck.
Watching this terrible progression of bombs cooking off, fuel tanks heating and bursting into flames, ammunition exploding, and men dying, stands as dark testimony to the savage volatility of an active flight deck.
The only alternative is to haul hoses aft from the forward stations. And this takes time, precious time. 13:52 and 43 seconds. The 2 main fire parties are now on deck working close to the flames, but so far only one hose is actually operating. The first explosion carries a message. The Forrestal is in deep trouble. It won't end here. The chain has started. And yet those who have survived it turn around and head back. There are buddies back there, and the chief with the purple K is dead. A fire at sea is the ultimate nightmare for any sailor. You can't run away from it. There's nowhere to go. It's a fight for survival. Your instincts have to be right. Your courage pinned on like a badge. Following the third explosion, the first 2 fire parties had been virtually wiped out. The fire was now completely out of control. A great ship was on the verge of dying. To save her, other men were going to have to go back on deck, most of them without sufficient training in firefighting techniques. Down below, fuel was pouring through holes in the flight deck caused by the continuous 1,000-pound bomb explosions. The fire had chased after the fuel, spreading quickly to the O3, O2, and O1 gallery decks and into the after end of Hangar Bay 3. Topside, the only hope was that the explosions would somehow subside. Until they did, no firefighting team could possibly survive on deck. In all, during the fire's first 5 minutes, 9 major explosions would take place on the flight deck. As the first of the injured were brought to safety in a sponson area, another relief party was already forming up. They knew what they needed most on deck, the foam hoses. For some unknown reason, 1 or more of the fog foam stations hadn't been initially charged. Some of the firefighters either didn't know that it was necessary to perform certain manual functions on the flight deck and hangar decks to get the foam systems operating, or they were injured or killed before they got to them. On deck, the relief party's first move was to lay down a curtain of foam between the flames and the Forrestal's island. Once this buffer zone was established, some of the damaged planes could be moved to safety. Along the port side, where most of the armed aircraft were parked, things were still out of control. Trapped in close quarters, between a constantly exploding inferno and the edge of the deck, several men had no choice. They went overboard. Some were actually blown over the side. Luckily for the ones who survived the experience, rescue helicopters from the carrier Oriskany and 2 destroyers had arrived on the scene. As quickly as they could, they swept into the Forrestal's wake to make pickups. Here, on the lower left-hand corner of the flat camera picture, is further evidence of a successful team effort. Notice that a fog nozzle has been correctly brought into play over the heads of the firefighters to protect them as they work. Leadership and on-deck communications were early casualties of the Forrestal fire. Damage control and repair party personnel were often unidentified for long periods of time. As a result, when some of the more inexperienced people did lend a hand, they made several well-intentioned but nearly disastrous mistakes. At one point, close to the island, 2 water hose teams were working in tandem with a foam hose team. The end result, the water washed away the foam, and the fire continued blazing away. But whatever their faults, whatever mistakes they made, it's impossible to fault their courage. Before this day was over, 134 of them would pay with their lives or be listed as missing. Due to the fire's suddenness and intensity, the sick bay filled up quickly with the injured. So quickly, in fact, that an emergency battle dressing station had to be set up on the forecastle. Less than an hour after the fire broke out, word came from Da Nang that the hospital ship Repose was on its way and would be there the following morning. Meanwhile, the 2 destroyers in the immediate vicinity took turns moving in to supply what they could and continued picking up firefighters who had gone overboard. Four minutes after the fire started, the divisional doors between hangar bays 1 and 2 and 2 and 3 had been closed, effectively isolating each of the bays and preventing the spread of the fire. In hangar bay 3, the sprinkler system and some effective work with the foam hose kept the fire confined to the engine shop and the after end of the bay itself. Here, as everywhere on board, air group personnel and air department personnel, all men not assigned to any specific firefighting duties, pitched in to help. In those hangar areas still untouched by the fire, regular crew teams and all available personnel worked feverishly to bring aircraft topside and all the way forward on the flight deck. In one of the sponson areas, the firefighters had decided to stay with it. There were only 2 ways out, through the fire or over the side. They took the fire. They had no way of knowing that the fire boundaries had already been firmly established. If everyone played his cards right, it wouldn't spread any further. The flames could now be fought aft progressively, compartment by compartment, textbook fashion, until the fire was out. On deck, the first sign that the battle was being won was the presence of white smoke. Obviously, the foam and fog nozzle teams were doing an effective job. But here and there, several glaring errors were still being committed. Several hose teams had men who were without shirts or protective gear of any kind. A fuel tank explosion, close up, no matter how small, would have burned most of them to a crisp. And almost unbelievably, some of the water hose teams were still hard at work washing away the protective blanket the foam teams had laid down. Here and there, black smoke had actually started rising again. the words of one observer, a veteran firefighter, there were times on the Forrestal when the men seemed to be using water for water's sake. If they found an open hole caused by one of the bomb explosions, they just kept pouring water in it. As a result, the Forrestal suffered thousands of dollars worth of damage to its onboard computers and several other pieces of intricate gear which hadn't been directly threatened by the fire. By mid-afternoon, helicopters from the carriers Oriskany and Bonhomme Richard were arriving on deck with fresh foam and OBA canisters, and then taking the overflow of the Forrestal's wounded back with them to their sick bay areas. The fire on deck would end on the afternoon it began. The fires below would rage on through the night and into the evening of the following day. The obvious lessons to be learned from the Forrestal tragedy are these. Original, in-depth training in firefighting is vastly important, but so is constant retraining. Every man on board should have been familiar with the ship's firefighting gear and its use. Some men never reached their general quarters stations. Others, unsure of alternate exits or ways out, were trapped below and died. Many of the firefighters lacked leadership. The chain of command had to be rebuilt on the spot after the first two firefighting teams were decimated. Too much time was spent struggling with items like the OBA. Some of the men actually had to stop and read the instructions before they could use them. Only untrained men would spray water across a foam blanket that was doing its job. Only untrained men would hot handle unexploded ordnance or kick it across the deck with their feet. These are things that can't be learned on the spot or after a fire starts. The fact that the men of the Forrestal pulled it off is a tribute to their coolness and courage. But we'll never know how many men were lost because some things were done the wrong way.
What can one take away from these images? Naval aviation is different, that is true. It's tough. It is a job. They signed up for it, they do it, and most won't trade it for the world. The naval aviators, personnel, and those who see it, crash footage reminds all that there are no easy days. It also reminds us why we owe so much to those few who feel the call to fly from a carrier into harm's way.